So the floor goes now to Marjolijn van Deelen, Special Envoy for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation at the European Union External Action Service. Marjolijn, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Ettore. And first of all, a warm welcome from my side also to participants and speakers at this year's virtual edition of the annual conference on non-proliferation and disarmament, organized by the EU Consortium. As Ettore set out, the EU Consortium is the group of organizations that run the EU Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Network of independent EU think tanks and research centers on non-proliferation and disarmament. This network was set up 10 years ago this year, so congratulations on that are in order. I just wanted to mark that moment. Congratulations are also in order for the Istituto Affari Internazionale, Ettore Greco and his team, who are the ones in the consortium that organized this annual conference. And I would wholeheartedly like to thank you for organizing. Well, for this panel, we have two excellent speakers, both with outstanding credentials and long-time experience in arms control, non-proliferation and disarmament. First of all, we have Ambassador Fu Chong, Director General of the Department of Arms Control of China. And we have Dr. Chris Ford, Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of International Security and Non-Proliferation of the Department of State of the US, also acting Undersecretary. I'm really sorry to report that Russian colleagues have declined our invitation. I would really have liked to listen to their views during this conference, but unfortunately that was not in the cards this time. Now, this first panel is about trust building in arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament. And also, as High Representative Nakamitsu referred to, trust building is one of the issues that is most necessary in our times. It's often been said that with the rise of great power competition, and with treaties under pressure, with multilateralism under pressure, rebuilding of trust is crucial. And I agree with that. And I would like to add that the lack of interpersonal contact due to the pandemic is adding to the stress that our system is under. Trust is an essential element for all sorts of interactions between states. And by the way, also between people. But in our area of work, its importance is even set out in the preamble of our beloved NPT. And I quote, "Desiring to further the easing of international tension and the strengthening of trust between states in order to facilitate the cessation of the manufacture of nuclear weapons, the liquidation of all their existing stockpiles, and the elimination from national arsenals of nuclear weapons and the means of their delivery pursuant to a treaty of general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control." And this panel is about how to do that. Now, what is trust building? To answer that question, many activities can be listed, but dialogue always comes first to mind. Direct contact is crucial, combined with political will to engage openly. Trust needs to be built over time, and it's often built through small actions rather than grandiose gestures. But needless to say, I wouldn't mind grandiose gestures, but the small ones are also very, very important. Re-engagement in bilateral and multilateral dialogue between nuclear policy communities could lead to breaking the echo chambers around national policy groups and to developing nuanced and sophisticated understanding about the other's nuclear policies. Direct contact and candid exchanges would also lead to exposing each other to different perspectives, to creating conditions for self-reflection and for building empathy, to developing interpersonal trust, and to cultivating openness and transparency. In that respect, I have found the extensive work in the P5 context extremely important. And I want to salute China for having given this process an enormous impulse during its chairmanship of the P5. And I also want to commend the UK with the way they have brought it forward in the past year. At another conference earlier this week, we heard how France, as the current chair, is intent on continuing these efforts. Many non-nuclear weapon states want to see more of that, and they want to see results. But that should not be seen as a lack of interpretation of the work that's being done in that format. I see how challenging it must be, but I do want you to carry on full steam ahead. I would also like to point to the valuable discussions under the CEND initiative. This is an innovative and outstanding format to have discussions beyond the P5 format about issues such as doctrines and institutions and risk reduction. In my view, the fact that those discussions are not negotiations about positions creates space for much more candid and open-minded discussions. So what else can we do? These are the questions I'd like to put to our two esteemed panelists. Is it still possible to find common ground between the different national interests and priorities, and in particular to restore confidence between the major powers? What new initiatives can be undertaken to preserve and consolidate the existing multilateral and non-proliferation and disarmament regimes? How can arms control and verification systems be enhanced? And finally, in view of the rapidly developing new technologies that High Representative Nakamitsu also talked about, what are the new frontiers of arms control? I would like to give the floor to the speakers in the order that they are listed in the program. So first to Ambassador Fu and then to Dr. Ford. After their interventions, I will open the floor for questions. But given that this is a virtual format, I'd already like you to start putting your questions in the function that you have there on the right of your screen, so that I will be able to collect them and maybe put some of them together, so that we can get in as much as we can in the Q&A part of the session. So with that introduction, I'd like to give the floor to Ambassador Cong. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Van der Leen. Good evening from Beijing to everybody. Let me start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to this important conference. And also I want to thank High Representative Borrell for the message. And let me say that China attaches great importance to the role that EU plays in the field of arms control and disarmament. And I personally am looking forward to our bilateral consultation early next month. And we have so many things to talk about, and we have there are so many things on which we can cooperate, and not least on the issue of small arms, which High Representative Borrell has mentioned very emphatically. I also want to thank High Representative Izumi Nakamitsu for the opening speech. And I want to say that I share many of the points that she raised during that speech. And also I want to, in particular, congratulate her on a successful first committee, despite the difficult circumstances. Now, turning to my prepared statement for today's discussion, let me say that today the international security situation is faced with the gravest challenges since the end of Cold War, and the international arms control architecture is at a critical juncture. The pursuit of unilateralist policies and withdrawal from a large number of international treaties and organizations by the US have dealt heavy blows to the multilateral and the bilateral arms control and disarmament regime established since the end of World War II. Cold War mentality and double standard are impeding international non-proliferation cooperation and undermining the authority and effectiveness of the international non-proliferation mechanism. The development of science and technology is bringing forth complex and profound repercussions on strategic stability and giving rise to a host of humanitarian, legal, and ethical challenges. Against this backdrop, it is pertinent and timely to exchange views on the theme of rebuilding mutual trust in arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament, the way forward. So it is both a pleasure and an honor for me to have the opportunity to share my thoughts on this topic. In my view, in order to move international arms control non-proliferation process forward, concerted efforts need to be made in the following areas. First, we should adhere to the basic principles and concepts of arms control. The purpose of international arms control is to enhance the security of all countries through cooperation so as to achieve equal, common, and universal security. Arms control that aims at increasing one's own security at the expense of the security of others is neither acceptable nor sustainable. Over the past century, despite the changes in arms control, both in terms of content and the paradigm, the basic international consensus has always been that maintaining strategic balance and stability should be a basic principle that guides international arms control efforts. However, what the US has been done in recent years has violated this basic principle. Its intention is to negate the checks and balances between the major powers and establish a unipolar world. That is the root cause of the stalemate in the international arms control and disarmament process. Competition between major powers is only natural and sometimes even inevitable. What is important is to search for win-win solutions instead of playing a zero-sum game, and to keep this competition under control by maintaining global strategic stability so as to reduce the risks of war. I have to say that recently some US high officials have come up with some new, and I would say absurd, theories and coinages, such as the 3 largest nuclear weapon states, or depicting arms control as a battle between democracies and non-democracies. I think these rhetorics distort the basic narratives of the international arms control and go against the basic principles guiding international arms control efforts. They can only poison the atmosphere of international dialogue and cannot be conducive to rebuilding trust. I think the international community should be vigilant against them. And second point I want to make is that we should safeguard the existing international arms control architecture. This point has already been made by previous speakers. And as Rome was not built in a day, progress can only be made by building upon past achievements. The existing international arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation regime, including the bilateral arms control treaties between the US and Russia, is an important component of the international security system and the basis for resolving security dilemmas through a cooperative approach and for realizing common security and the universal disarmament. That system is a valuable common asset of the international community and should be strengthened rather than weakened. The continuous withdrawal of the US from international treaties has not only damaged its own credibility, but also jeopardized international security. The international community should be united in rejecting the totally irresponsible actions taken by the current US administration aimed at sabotaging the international arms control architecture. The immediate priority now is to urge the US to respond as soon as possible to Russia's call for the unconditional extension of the New START. In addition, the international community should adhere to the existing international consensus, including the final document of SSOD1 and the outcome documents of the previous NPT review conferences, highlight the special and the primary responsibilities of the two largest nuclear weapon states for nuclear disarmament, and say no to the words and deeds that overthrow or undermine international consensus on arms control. Third point, we should further strengthen and expand the international arms control architecture. While upholding the past achievements of the international arms control system, we also need to keep moving with the times and constantly renew and improve the system. The international community need to agree that fruits of scientific and technological development should be used to the maximum extent possible for peaceful purpose, for peaceful development, and that there should be limits to their military utilization. We should push forward negotiations on cyberspace, outer space, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and others, with a view to concluding legally binding international instruments or code of conduct as soon as possible, and establishing relevant international mechanisms so as to guard against or reduce potential risks and challenges that these technologies could bring to international stability and security due to the absence of international rules. The sudden outbreak of COVID-19 has put biosecurity under the spotlight and highlighted the importance and urgency of strengthening global biosecurity governance. In this context, it is important to restart the negotiation of BWC verification protocol as soon as possible, with a view to establishing an effective international verification mechanism to safeguard biosecurity. We hope that next year's review conference of the convention could make a decision in that respect. At the same time, and we urge the US not to block that process. At the same time, it is also necessary to establish a scientific advisory body under the framework of the convention and to formulate codes of conduct to better regulate biological scientific research and promote the healthy development of biotechnology. With the rapid development of digital economy, the issue of data security becomes increasingly prominent and calls for a global solution. It is high time that we formulated global rules reflecting the interests and concerns of the majority of countries on the basis of universal participation. For the purpose of effectively dealing with the risks and the challenges associated with data security, China has lately launched the Global Initiative on Data Security, which calls on all countries to take action to prevent and to put an end to activities that impair and steal important data of other countries' critical infrastructure, or jeopardize personal information, oppose mass surveillance against other countries through ICTs, remove mandatory requirements for domestic companies to store in their own territory data generated and obtained overseas, and to require enterprises not to install backdoors in their products and services. This initiative provides a basis for the formulation of global rules and represents also solemn commitments by China on data security. China hopes that our interlocutors could support the initiative, and we also welcome suggestions for improvement. Fourthly, we should resolve non-proliferation disputes through peaceful means. Non-proliferation issues, such as the nuclear issue on the Korean Peninsula and the Iran nuclear issue, are complex issues that can only be resolved through political and diplomatic means. Facts have shown that maximum pressure under the threat of force will only make the issues more complicated. Sanctions are not the end, nor a panacea. Sanctions are means, so are the lifting or relaxing of sanctions. If the legitimate security and the development concerns of Iran or North Korea are not properly addressed, attempts to impose solutions through sanctions will go nowhere. Under the current situation, all parties should firmly fulfill the JCPOA obligations and resolutely oppose unilateral sanctions and the long-arm jurisdiction. The parties concerned should resolve their differences in the implementation of the agreement through dialogue and consultation and within the framework of the Joint Commission. By restoring the balance of rights and obligations under the agreement, China also attaches importance to the concerns of all parties on the issue of regional security and advocates the creation of a new platform for dialogue on all issues related to regional security and stability. Trying to force North Korea to abandon its entire nuclear program in one go without addressing its security and economic concerns is unlikely to succeed. The best way forward is to make progress through a synchronized, reciprocal, and a phased process. China urges the US to demonstrate its good faith by responding to the legitimate and the reasonable concerns of DPRK on security and development with practical actions, so as to bring the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula back on track. Last point, we should establish an inclusive and effective international non-proliferation mechanism. It is a common responsibility of the international community to prevent the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. However, for a long time, the existing export control mechanisms have been hindered by the lack of representation and double standard, or even outright discrimination. In recent years, these problems have only been further exacerbated. The US is trying to forge an alliance based on ideological demarcation against high-tech exports to countries like China and transform these export control mechanisms into tools for high-tech blockade and decoupling from China. For that purpose, the US has strenuously obstructed China from joining these mechanisms. Such practices have seriously undermined the foundation of international non-proliferation cooperation and disrupted normal international cooperation on science and technology and trade. The international community should be in line with genuine multilateralism and the rule of law, oppose such tendencies of politicization and polarization, and endeavor to establish a fair and inclusive non-proliferation control regime based on equal participation of all countries. I thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fu, for your presentation and your statement. And with that, I would like to immediately turn to Dr. Ford to hear his intervention and his views. And in the meantime, I would already like to encourage everyone to start putting questions in the questions and answer mechanism on the right. I see two, but I'd encourage you to already start typing away. Dr. Ford, you have the floor. Good morning.
Hello, I hope you can hear me. Am I coming through? Marvelous,
Yep.
thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to participate in this very important conference, even if only virtually, and for your flexibility in allowing me to attend here from my family holiday. So thanks for letting that be possible. With some having struck an unfortunately but characteristically belligerent and accusatory tone, I thought actually what I would try to do in my remarks was perhaps say a few words about how we in the US have been trying to struggle with some of the security challenges that Russian and Chinese destabilization of the global security environment have been presenting us with, and indeed presenting the free and open international order upon which international peace and security have depended for so long. From the perspective of the little corner of the State Department for which I have been honored with responsibility for the last few years. And I guess by looking back over these last few years and describing some of the ways in which we have tried to address these challenges in order to meet those security threats and to help make the world a safer place. It's certainly the case, unfortunately, that the global security environment has not ended up being the one that the world hoped for after the end of the Cold War. It has not been an enduringly benign security environment in which Beijing and Moscow have become responsible stakeholders in the international system. It has unfortunately become very clear that those two governments have set for themselves an agenda of changing and reordering the security environment around themselves in ways profoundly to the detriment of the democracies of the world and indeed of international peace and security that has depended upon that free and open order that I referred to before. So, that deteriorating security environment, I think, has had ripple effects throughout international security policy. And what I'd like to do is to say a few words about how we, during the last 4 years, have tried to address or to respond to some of those things. So I should start with arms control, because, of course, that's been an eventful last few years, marked first and foremost, I would emphasize, by our determination in the United States to take compliance with arms control agreements much more seriously than before. Back in 2017, we adopted new strategies, for example, to respond to Russia's ongoing violation of the INF Treaty and of the Treaty on Open Skies. We stepped up our diplomacy to bring allies and partners into to calling Russia out for its violations and holding it to account. We implemented unilateral steps to put more pressure on the Kremlin to finally give it concrete incentives to change course. And we made very clear that our patience with chronic, unaddressed Russian violations was not going to be infinite patience. Now, of course, as we all know, Russia rather famously opted not to change course. It chose to destroy the INF Treaty rather than to stop deploying battalion after battalion of the prohibited missiles, the intermediate range ground launch cruise missiles that it had built in violation of the treaty. It also opted to sit back and watch the United States withdraw from the Open Skies Treaty in response to Russia's chronic violations from the very moment that that treaty entered into force and its manipulation of Open Skies implementation. Rather than cease those activities, it was perfectly happy to in effect drive us out by the games that it was playing with the treaty. Now, this is, of course, both these things are things that we deeply regret. It had been our hope all along to persuade the Kremlin and indeed to give the Kremlin concrete incentives to change course and to start complying, in fact, with both treaties once again. But of course, Russia didn't do that. It made irresponsible choices, and it is responsible for having wrecked one of those important agreements and having gravely damaged the other. Now, of course, Russia has, not surprisingly, tried to make these incidents into pieces of their propaganda narrative that the United States is in some fashion against arms control. And you've heard some of that silliness from Ambassador Fu as well today. But it's worth emphasizing the degree to which all of that, of course, is errant nonsense. And in fact, the forceful US approach to arms control compliance that we have been very focused upon here, I was going to say here in Washington, that's actually not true. Here in in the mountains where I am holidaying. That approach to arms control compliance, our refusal to accept endemic violations, for example, actually demonstrates how seriously we take arms control. No country that that willingly accepts a situation in which one side chronically violates an arms control agreement can possibly be said to be serious about arms control. So precisely because, and to the degree that we are serious about arms control and about the security benefits that arms control can bring if its rules are honored, we must ensure that those obligations are not ignored, and we must ensure that chronic violations are not tolerated. Now, there might be terms to describe a situation in which one party gets to threaten the other with whatever it wants, while the threatened party promises never to do anything in response to those threats. But the terms don't include arms control. There's no good term for that, but arms control is certainly not that. And so what we've seen over the last few years is Russia's scofflaw self-aggrandizement in this area, having destroyed important international instruments or damaged them very gravely. And that is all to be regretted, but it's something with which we all have to deal and that the Kremlin has forced us to confront. Despite all that, our commitment to serious arms control remains undimmed. And it's precisely that commitment that has underlain the United States' call for a new arms control framework, not just with Russia, but also with China, in order to meet some of the challenges that the security environment presents us. I think such a framework is necessary and really important for at least two reasons. The first simply being that it's necessary in order to prevent a dangerous new spiral in the nuclear arms race. Everyone is familiar, of course, with all of the challenges that are being created by the Russian and Chinese nuclear buildups. Russia, of course, building these bizarre and dangerous new strategic delivery systems and expanding the arsenal of non-strategic weapons that threaten Europe, East Asia, China, very prominently. That's certainly a problem that needs to be addressed. And of course, China is itself rapidly building up the size of its nuclear arsenal, despite the enormous reduction in the nuclear threats that face China over the last 30 years or so. So partly a new framework is critical to prevent that from all of this from spiraling out of control. And partly also a new framework is necessary in order for all three of these powers to fulfill their obligations under Article 6 of the NPT, to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament. We've been working very hard to try to bring such a framework into existence and set the stage for answers to these problems over the long term. Unfortunately, it's pretty obvious, of course, how unserious Beijing clearly is about its responsibilities as a nuclear power to engage in responsible arms control negotiations. It continues to shun even talking with us about what a future framework might look like. And so, clearly that's a problem. The Russians have been somewhat more responsive, and they have met with our special envoy repeatedly. It's not clear to me precisely why Moscow is finding it so hard to agree upon the principle of capping the expansion of our arsenals. That would seem an elementary sort of thing. You can't talk about future reductions ideally unless you stop the hemorrhaging of what's currently going on. And so it's a bit mysterious as to why they can't agree to that. But we certainly hope to have some kind of an agreement to that effect in the near future in connection with extending New START in order to provide time in which to engage in the kind of negotiations needed to find a really long-term and effective answer in both of these respects, and also to make sure that China comes into this process and is not simply a free rider on everyone else's hard work in diplomacy and negotiation. While all that's been going on, we of course have remained committed, you will not be surprised to hear, to ensuring that we and our allies and partners remain capable of deterring aggression, including through the extended nuclear deterrent umbrella, as it's called, that we offer to our military allies, and which, I should stress, still represents the world's most effective non-proliferation tool. In my little corner of the State Department, we are the sort of diplomatic piece of this, and we've been at the forefront of international dialogues on extended deterrence and cooperation in these respects. We've also been working very hard to strengthen our security partnerships, which is also a critical piece of ensuring that Russian and Chinese revisionism do not gravely destabilize the international order and plunge us all into conflict. We've been doing a lot of work over the last few years in strengthening our security partnerships through things such as arms transfer and capacity building engagements. This has increased the resilience of our partners and allies in their ability to support shared security objectives and bolstered them against threats from countries as diverse as Iran and North Korea on the one hand in the regional context, to Russia and of course China in the global context. We have expanded the range of partners whose armed services are interoperable with our own, which I think is very effective in helping deter aggression. And I should say it is also important to have that interoperability in the event that deterrence fails and it is necessary to defeat aggression. Our arms transfers have been used very strategically towards this end, including in the last 4 years or so, something upwards of $272 billion worth of transfers, as well as billions of dollars in support to partner security programs in the Indo-Pacific, pursuant to our Indo-Pacific strategy. We think these are very important contributions to not just regional, but global security, and we are steadfastly committed, of course, to continuing them. As Ambassador Fu alluded to, we've also been working very hard in my part of the State Department to take some of the tools that we developed in order to keep dangerous weaponry out of the hands of terrorists and rogue regimes. Things like our skills in implementing non-proliferation sanctions, technology transfer controls, worldwide capacity building programming of this sort to help partners implement best practices in these arenas. We've been taking those tools and also applying them to the arena of great power competition, with a particular focus upon China's disruptive strategy of stealing technology abroad and diverting it to support its military programs that threaten its neighbors and global security. I've talked extensively about this, and we don't need to go into all the details of military-civil fusion here, but we've been sounding the alarm about that challenge since early 2018 and building, I think, some very effective policy responses. At least in this part of the State Department that I represent, we have been leading what is in effect a veritable revolution in U.S. national security export controls and technology transfer diplomacy. We've been doing technology transfer threat awareness diplomacy around the world, building what I call coalitions of caution against PRC-related technology transfer threats, mobilizing resistance to the depredations and technology theft and strategic manipulations associated with state-sponsored national champion technology sectors, whether that is in things like telecommunications and 5G or in the civil nuclear arena. And we're working with our interagency partners to develop things like tougher semiconductor export control rules to prevent the free economies and technology sectors of the West from being exploited for military purposes by China's military strategy. And we've begun to look at the future of emerging technologies and foundational technologies and how we can better answer these challenges through that prism as well. So if you happen to be a Communist Party strategist in Beijing, I suppose that makes us terrible villains. But if you're from a country that adheres to democratic values and relishes political autonomy and independence and the free and open international order that we've all depended upon for so long, I think this is going to be looking like a very profoundly good thing. Let me say a word about chemical and biological threats, which Izumi mentioned a few minutes ago. This has been a terrible era for those threats as well. And I'm not simply referring just to the obvious problems that are presented by North Korea and Iran. Russia, of course, rather infamously used a Novichok nerve agent to attempt to assassinate Sergei Skripal in the United Kingdom in 2018. That episode revealed to the world the existence of Russia's continuing chemical weapons program, its Novichoks, for example, and publicly resurfaced the idea of these sorts of horrific weapons in the hands of great powers using them against each other in the global context, which people haven't, unfortunately, had to be confronted with for a long time. Another Novichok agent was, of course, recently used against Alexei Navalny just last August. And we and our friends and partners have been in the forefront of pushing back against these various horrific and illegal acts by implementing sanctions against Russia. And we've already successfully added 2 families of Novichok agents to the Chemical Weapons Convention Annex of Chemicals. That's all important, but we should not be unaware of the ways in which the norms against the use of chemical weapons have been eroding and the imperative of turning that around. But I want to stress it's not just a chemical weapons problem. Concerns regarding biological weapons programs in the hands of geopolitical revisionist authoritarian leaders that are determined to undermine the security interests of the world's democracies. This is not a fantasy. This is unfortunately all too real of a challenge. For many years, it was not possible to say much in public, alas, about great power BW threats. But we've finally begun to lift the curtain upon those threats and the potentially terrifying implications of biological weapons based upon modern life sciences technology. In August of 2020, although it was little noticed at the time, but the US Department of Commerce added to its so-called entity list of persons and organizations that are found to be engaged in activities contrary to our security interests, 3 Russian institutions that were described as being associated with the Russian biological weapons program. To my knowledge, that is the first time in public that we have stated that there is, in fact, still a Russian biological weapons program, and one should not overlook the implications of that. So this is all a very threatening environment and a big challenge that we all have to face together. While I would stress that we clearly have left behind our prior complacency about great power competitive challenges in the United States, no one should mistake our approach for one today that is unreflectively hostile. We have been very clear that we try to mix elements of competition where we need to be with cooperation wherever we can and where there are shared interests. And that's an important piece to remember in this discussion today on how we can rebuild trust. We certainly continue to prize and to seek dialogue and engagement, even with competitors whose strategies threaten our security and our well-being. We have conducted multiple strategic security dialogues with our Russian counterparts, as well as important space security exchanges with both Russia and the PRC. Our efforts to have a strategic security dialogue with Beijing have, of course, rather famously not been reciprocated, and there has been no answer received from the PRC in response to a U.S. invitation nearly a year ago, despite Cong saying in public last January in London that they would be giving us an answer soon, he proclaimed. So clearly, China remains contemptuous of that kind of direct engagement on these security issues with us, and it's terribly unfortunate. But perhaps this is an opportunity for us to encourage Ambassador Fu to take a different course. But clearly, in the United States, we do seek engagement, we do seek dialogue, and I would say that it's important, not despite the challenges that we face in this competitive environment, but actually because of it. And it's the competitive challenges that we face and the difficulties in that security environment that make that kind of engagement and dialogue directly between the participants all the more important than ever. So Marjolijn, you asked at the beginning, is it possible to find common ground and to rebuild trust? And my answer is, I think it is, and I want to find out. So let's all call upon our Russian and Chinese counterparts to sit down with the United States and try to start working some of these problems out directly face to face, and not playing rhetorical games with the usual laundry lists of feel-good rhetorical virtue signaling, but in fact taking a firm position to come to the table and actually have a talk about how the future can look better than the past and how we can get through these challenges together. There is no substitute for direct face-to-face engagement, and we call upon China to join us in that bilateral dialogue as soon as possible. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that. And again, really appreciated you taking out the time during your holidays. It's very good to see your very scenic background. It is soothing to us. There's a lot of questions coming in. It's more than I wished for. Maybe I shouldn't have called for that many. I will try to group them a little bit and maybe take several rounds if we can squeeze them in. First, a couple of questions directed to Ambassador Cong. What are the objectives of China to achieve in the next 2 years in the fields of arms control and disarmament? And in the same vein, can China commit itself not to expand its nuclear arsenal while the US and Russia are reducing theirs? If not, why not? And then more in general, moving a little bit to the P5. Sorry, that's the question. The question here by Sebastian: do you believe the P5 states could, through careful dialogue, develop a shared set of responsibilities in relation to initiatives, in relation to nuclear weapons that would rebuild trust? So shared set of responsibilities. Also related to the P5 is the question of transparency in the P5 process, how that can be helpful and moved forward. And also in that context, how the discussion of peaceful uses can be of help in confidence building. So I'd like to leave it at those two sets for now and hear your responses. And then hopefully we can get in many of the other questions in the next round. Maybe keep the same order, and I'd ask Ambassador Cong to respond first.
Thank you, Chair. Before answering questions from the audience, I want to say a few words in response to what Chris has said, and basically to dispel some of the misinformation he has spread. First and foremost, on the bilateral dialogue. Well, actually, I think, Chris, you're not very up to date to the information or even to internal information sharing. Indeed, you wrote to me last year, and then later on, someone called Marshall Billingsley came out, and also, he also wrote to me. And I did respond to him, thinking that he was a representative of the US government. Of course, I'm not saying that you are not, but indeed, I did respond to him. And there were several rounds of exchanges of letters. And for your information, that we even had a phone conversation, even though that conversation was not very pleasant, but still we did have a phone conversation. So what you were saying, I actually, in addition to what you said tonight, actually I also read some statement, your previous statement, saying that China has not responded to this bilateral consultation, so on and so forth. Let me say that this is not true. As a matter of fact, we have been responding to the US through email, through letters, and even we talked on telephone. And actually, as a matter of fact, we even went so far as to say that we would be ready to talk to the US side. The only question was that Billingsley insisted on having a face-to-face conversation, dialogue, and I proposed a virtual one because of the pandemic. So that is the update. So Chris, you need to be updated by your colleagues, or you may want to go back and check with your colleagues. And but I also want to emphasize that China is open to bilateral dialogues with the US, like we are open to dialogues with EU and other partners. But these dialogues has to be based on mutual respect. It should not become a venue for blackmail, which Billingsley tried to turn that conversation into. So that is the point number one. I want to clarify the issue so that there will be no further misinformation from the US side. Second point I want to say concerning what Chris has said about the US being very serious about compliance with the arms control treaties. I know that the US has been portraying their withdrawal from all these arms control treaties in a light as if they were withdrawn because of their concern about compliance. I don't think this can fool anybody. We all know why the reason. Just let me say this. For the parties to a treaty to have concerns on compliance of the other side is nothing extraordinary. And the best way or the normal way to resolve all these concerns is through dialogue, not by withdrawing from the treaties. So we know that the US are withdrawing from the treaties because they thought that these treaties are binding their hands in expanding their military capabilities. And that is the reason why they withdraw from the treaty, not because they have concerns of the other side having not being in compliance with. I can give you one example. The JCPOA, the US withdrew from that treaty, from that agreement. Which side did not comply with that agreement before the US withdrew? Even the US government says that all sides were complying, and still the US withdrew from that treaty, from that agreement. On the New START, if the only concern you have is about the compliance, the US government has said they have no concern about the US complying with the treaty. So why don't you extend that treaty? So why do you come up with all these excuses to delay this ratification? So all these arguments about being serious about compliance is not going to fool anybody. That is the second point. And the third point about—
Ambassador Cong, are you turning to the answering the questions?
Yes, I'm answering the question Chris posed.
Yeah, but I'm posing questions.
Okay, yes, I'll come
And
to
the
your
audience
question.
is posing questions.
I don't want the misinformation to stand. And the third issue I want to talk about is about the arms race. China has not engaged in arms race for the past decades, and that is the whole reason why China's nuclear forces has been maintained at such a low level. Any objective person would understand that. So accusing China of engaging in an arms race when the US is spending $1.2 trillion to upgrade its nuclear arsenal does not hold water. And we all know what Berners-Lee said. They want the US can outspend the US can outspend China and Russia into oblivion. That's what he said. And then you accuse China of engaging in arms race. Come on, Chris. And then the fourth point, again, we heard this nonsense about a communist party or communism versus democracy and all this. As I said in my statement, if the US sees arms control through that light, from that perspective, I can't see how we can make progress. And that's why I said in my statement, one of the basic principles is, admittedly, we do have different ideologies, but that should not prevent us from making compromises on arms control issues, because that is more important than ideological debates. But the US, during the Trump administration, has introduced this ideological discussion or debate into the arms control discussion. I think that is one of the reasons why we cannot make progress, because what happened during the Cold War, despite the ideological demarcation differences, the two sides could talk to each other and reach agreement. If you insist that this is a battle or this is a fight between democrats and non-democrats, I can't see how we can sit down even and talk about all these issues. So, so that is why I said in my prepared statement, we should keep all these ideological debates out of the discussion of arms control. And that is the only way we can make progress. But unfortunately, the US, the current administration of the US has been propagating all these ideological differences in the international, in United Nations, in other international fora. And that is not being very helpful. I do hope that the new administration can change course on that at least.
I'm sorry, I do want to put in the question because of what you said just now. Can China commit itself not to expand its nuclear arsenal with the US and Russia if the US and Russia are reducing theirs?
Exactly.
That relates to what you just said.
Yes, that is a big if, I would say, if the US agrees to reduce. That is a big if. But judging from what the Trump administration has been doing, they have not reduced. They are building up on the country. They are building up. They are what they are lowering is lowering the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons. We all read the NPR, haven't we? We all read the NPR. What it says It wants to build more nuclear weapons. It wants to lower the threshold. They want to expand the scenarios for the use of nuclear weapons. Can you imagine they even talk about using nuclear weapons against cyber attacks? We all know the cyber attacks.
Here, I'd like to hear about China.
Yes.
About your vision, not about the US. So could you comment?
Yes. What I wanted to say is the question was premised on one thing, that the US is going to reduce. As I said, that is a big if. Frankly, we don't believe. And then I come to that. As I said, China's policy will not change. The US officials have been talking about China changing its policy of minimum deterrence capabilities. That is not true. That is another misinformation. So when a country in possession of 6,000 nuclear warheads talks about a threat or being threatened by another country, which they themselves say have only about 200 nuclear warheads, and then say that that country poses a strategic threat to the US, what do you call that? I call that paranoid. So saying that the China is engaging in an arms race is totally untrue. But let me say this, China will maintain its minimum nuclear deterrence. China will maintain its no first use. And by definition, China will not expand to a large extent its nuclear arsenal. But it does not mean that China should not modernize. We cannot just sit there and see the US withdrawing all the, and Chris mentioned that there is a dramatic reduction of threats around China. We don't see that way, frankly speaking. We see more threats from the US. That is the basic point. So China, we do not deny that China is modernizing its nuclear arsenals. But so do all the other nuclear weapon states, the US in particular. And I will even add that even France and the UK are doing that. So the next question from the audience is from the P5 and transparency. Or do you want me to answer that question as well, or you want to give floor to Chris? I see Chris being very anxious to respond.
No, because I am sure he is, and I will definitely give him the opportunity. But dialogue is important, and it's good to see the dialogue between the two of you. But the audience is also here. And as you said that China is not to a large extent extending its nuclear weapon stockpile, but it is modernizing, that relates to that question of transparency. So if you could go into that a little bit more, because of course that is not very visible to others, especially to non-nuclear weapon states. Well, and if you could answer that question, and then I'll turn to Chris.
Okay, on the transparency, as we always say that there are basically two dimensions to transparency. One dimension is the doctrines, and the other is numbers, right? And in terms of the doctrines, China is extremely transparent. So the no first use and the minimum deterrence capability and all these things we are advocating. And then there was a question about what China's initiative would be for the next 2 years. We urge all nuclear weapon states to come on board with China to agree to the no first use. We see a glimmer of hope from the platform of the Democratic Democrats. We hope that can materialize. And that is one of the initiatives. So in terms of the transparency, the doctrine, China is extremely transparent. And we hope that the other sides can also be as transparent as China. In terms of the numbers, there are good reasons why China cannot be transparent in terms of the numbers. Because, let me say this, China has a no first use policy. And China is faced with a strategic competitor as big as the US, which has 6,000 nuclear warheads. In addition, they are developing missile defense, and they are deploying all these missiles around anti-missile defense systems around China. And they are even talking about deploying the intermediate range missiles around China. And that under such circumstances, how can you expect China to be transparent, as some people would hope, in terms of numbers? That will undermine China's strategic capability. So that is a matter of principle, and that is a matter of strategic importance. And I hope that I have answered that question in terms of the transparency. But it doesn't mean that China cannot do anything. That is the reason why we proposed in the P5 process that we should discuss all these issues. And that, unfortunately, it is the US and Chris himself has been belittling the P5 process, saying that this is not important and so on and so forth. But we do hope that the P5 mechanism could be better used. And we would venture to suggest that the P5 mechanism that has been established under the NPT review conference can expand beyond the nuclear issue. It should be a mechanism, it should be a P5 discussion on strategic stability, all issues that have an impact on strategic stability, nuclear weapons, missile defense, outer space, and all these issues need to be discussed under the P5 mechanism. And that is China's proposal, maybe for the new administration. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And thanks for answering the question on transparency. Of course, that position is well known, but it does put us in a bit of a bind that we cannot compare, as you have a different approach to transparency than some of the other nuclear weapon states. But with that, I want to turn to Chris. I'm also looking at the clock in the meantime, but so I will give Chris the same opportunity to make any remarks, and especially if he can, to answer the questions that were asked. Please, Chris.
Thank you. I actually was sort of enjoying the circus, but thanks for the chance to say a couple of words. I think I would say that I do agree with at least one thing that Cong has said, and that is that it is certainly the case that our differences of ideology should not prevent us from sitting down and talking about arms control and potentially making compromises to that end. That's precisely what we have been trying to get our Chinese counterparts to do with us. And I think it's sort of amusing here that Cong thinks he deserves some kind of credit for responding to our invitations to talk by in public repeatedly, contemptuously, and dismissively rejecting our invitations to sit down and have precisely those conversations. Now, any fool with a Google search can find multiple comments from him on that. So I don't pretend to understand how his comments actually hold together, but it is worth pointing out that China, as a country that purports to have a no first use policy and that purports to have a doctrine of minimum nuclear deterrence, that the nuclear threats facing China have absolutely fallen through the floor over the last generation. Since, for example, China joined the NPT in 1992. At the time when China joined the NPT, both Russia and the United States, both of whom have nuclear forces that are to some degree arrayed against China. The nuclear forces, the combined nuclear arsenals of Russia and the United States have fallen by something on the order of 60,000 weapons since China joined the NPT. So the nuclear threats that face Beijing over the last generation have absolutely collapsed. And you would think that a country that supposedly follows no first use and minimum deterrence would find the collapse of that threat a powerful reason to be willing to cap or even reduce its arsenal. And yet we see China building and building and building and shunning engagement with others about how to bring that nuclear arms race under control. That is, I think, what ought to gravely concern anyone who's paying the remotest bit of attention here. And in answer to your question, Marjolijn, I think what we need to at least start with, and I think it needs more than this, but need to at least start with China and Russia following in the footsteps of the kind of transparency and engagement that we in the United States have absolutely modeled for many, many years. We are unprecedentedly and uniquely transparent about doctrines, posture, numbers, budgets, all sorts of things of this nature. We are an open record to anyone who has any interest in these things. We urge others to follow that transparency. We think it's a model that should be emulated. We are eagerly seeking engagement, direct engagement with our counterparts on these very topics, as well as to sit down and brainstorm and negotiate with them about what a future framework to keep all of this from getting out of control should look like. So that's something that I think we should build upon and generalize. That's what we seek, and that's what Beijing refuses. And we have also worked very hard with our diplomatic counterparts around the world to come up with articulations of standards of responsible behavior in other domains that have an impact upon these broader security dynamics. Cyberspace, outer space, for example. We have been at the forefront of trying to build norms of responsible behavior in those arenas in order to hold accountable those who follow irresponsible paths. This is a really important area of work in which we have also been at the cutting edge of international diplomacy, working with partners in Europe and at least the democracies of East Asia at any rate. And this has been incredibly valuable. But what we see from the other side are games. You heard a little bit earlier from Ambassador Fu about the China data initiative, or whatever that was called. The irony of a Chinese official speaking about the dangers presented by the insecurity of electronic data and the dangers of mass surveillance. I mean, it is extraordinary to hear such things coming from a representative of the world's most foremost data and intellectual property thief, and a regime that has pioneered a variety of mass surveillance oppression that George Orwell could hardly have dreamed of on the basis of mid-20th century technology. This feels a bit like the chutzpah level. I mean, it's impressive in a sense, but it feels a bit like the chutzpah of someone who murders their parents and then asks for leniency from the judge because he's an orphan. This is not a serious diplomatic initiative. What we need is actual dialogue about actual security issues between people who take these things seriously and seek constructive solutions. We absolutely need to put aside our ideological differences in trying to reach those solutions. But you can't do it if one side sneers at the very process of dialogue. You can't do it if all that they engage in are diplomatic games designed to create the appearance of arms control initiatives while hiding transparently counterproductive or even dangerous ideas behind the curtain of their feel-good rhetoric. We can do so much more than this as an international community. We can do so much more than this bilaterally. And it is critical that we rebuild the kind of engagement that Beijing shuns with such contemptuousness, and you've heard this today. So let's try to do this better, and let's try to finally engage in the ways that we should, because we do face common security threats that desperately need to be met and can only be met through some kind of collaborative direct engagement of the very sort that Ambassador Fu treats with such derision. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you there, Chris. And this makes it very clear that there is indeed a lot of need for dialogue. And while witnessing how the discussion between the two of you goes, I think we would need a lot more time than just this panel to really get into the depth of all these issues and to answer the questions from the audience. So I can only conclude that we will need more time and more iterations of this kind of debates to allow for space for all these issues to be addressed, also with the questions posed. But we are running out of time. I think I will need to start ending the session if I have looked correctly at the agenda. But please, organizers, correct me if I'm wrong. And if not, I would just really like to thank both of you for coming to this event and to putting openly your issues and questions on the table. I get a message that I can extend a little bit if I want. Okay, if that's okay with you, with Chris and Fu, just a tiny bit. Okay, all right. Then I would like to get the one question in that I saw about the one by Sebastian, a shared set of responsibilities. Whether that could be developed in the P5 context that could rebuild trust. Maybe if you would both just briefly please answer that question. I don't know if you've seen it.
Rebuild trust.
Well, if I may.
Yeah, is that okay with you to just answer the one more question?
I think in order to rebuild trust, people, when they speak, they should mind their words. So hearing what Chris said, calling this discussion a circus, a discussion he doesn't like becomes a circus. You see how difficult it is to build trust. And yes. I can assure Chris that you won't endure the circus for much longer. And then in terms of the mass surveillance, it's not China saying this. The whole world is saying what the US is doing, the mass surveillance. You may not like the Chinese initiative, but why don't you call our bluff? You say this is not sincere. As we said, these initiatives are unilateral commitment. We would challenge the US to make the same unilateral commitment. We don't want other countries. We would hope other countries can join us. But if you don't, it doesn't matter. These are the unilateral commitment. You can mark that down. And we challenge the US to meet us, to undertake the same unilateral commitment. Can you do that? And on the mutual trust, indeed, we need to, the P5 need to sit down and talk about measures to rebuild trust. But the past 4 years have not been very helpful. And that's what I can say. And so that's why we're looking forward to the future. Thank you.
I'm going to turn directly to Chris. Maybe you would like to answer the question on responsibilities.
Sure. I actually will answer the question on responsibilities for a change of pace here. I would say that there are at least 3 levels on which these answers can be sought and should be sought. And the P5 is one of them. It's extremely important to continue that engagement. We have been deeply engaged with it. Ambassador Fu and our other counterparts and I have spent quite a bit of time in P5 discussions of various sorts. This is an important locus for dialogue, and we, of course, remain committed to it. Notwithstanding some efforts to dismiss it from the outside, as we just heard, we have found it very valuable, and I think that it objectively is so. It's very important for those particular states. I refer to them as the N5, of course, but one can call them whatever one likes. It's important that they be sitting down and having those kinds of discussions, and we have continued that and remain committed to that continuation. But that's not the only forum in which these things can and should be discussed. The bilateral aspect is critical as well. You've heard me calling in a heartfelt way for engagement on a bilateral basis with Chinese counterparts on these really important issues. It's disgraceful that that has not been possible, and that needs to be turned around. Trilateral engagement, of course, you will not be surprised to hear me saying is important. And of course, multilateral engagement. And here I want to emphasize also the degree to which there are, in fact, countries coming together virtually in real time this very month to across the various divides that have separated, human communities from each other over issues of nuclear weapons, issues of across NPT weapon states, non-weapon states, members of the ban treaty, states from the global north and the global south, developed, less developed, Arabs and Israelis, Indians and Pakistanis. We have had them coming together precisely in order, and Chinese and Russians as well, with us to come together to try to think through some of the security challenges that stand in the way of making more progress of the sort that we all want to do, heading towards the world envisioned by the NPT in the way that you so eloquently quoted at the outset of this discussion, Marjolijn, about the importance of easing tension and strengthening trust in order to facilitate disarmament. Our initiative, the CE&D initiative, is designed precisely to catalyze that kind of dialogue. I know that in your previous capacity, you were an important contributor to and facilitator of trying to get those kinds of engagements going. And I wanted to stress how important that is too. And that we are therefore committed to engagement on the bilateral, the trilateral, the P5, and the multilateral level, precisely in order to come to better answers to these challenges, to overcome the difficulties that the current security environment, the deteriorating security environment that has been created by Russian and Chinese strategy over the last few years, to try to bring these things to a better place. That kind of dialogue is indispensable, and we are firmly committed to it. And that is something that I am sure will continue no matter who is in charge in Washington. It is an enduring priority for those of us in the United States, and we hope very much that we will continue to have good partners in this, and that those who are not particularly constructive partners will become more so on a steadily more constructive basis. So thanks so much for the chance to say a few words about that.
Well, thank both of you for joining us in this conference and for being willing to participate in early morning or later in the evening. And I had omitted to also thank Izumi Nakamitsu for participating in the previous session, but of course her input is also always very much valued. It is clear that there is need for dialogue, and I'm happy we've been able to provide a platform for that, for a little tiny part of that today. I'm going to close this panel. I think we have a few minutes break for everybody to stretch their legs before we get to the next session. And I am getting an announcement, a small break of 5 minutes. All right, everybody. Well, thanks again. Virtual applause, I heard Ettore say, so applause to all of you. And thanks very much again. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me be part of this.
Thank you.